the main benefits to Calvin of this was to meet many of the prominent reformers of that day, both Reformed and Lutheran. And in the latter camp, we include Philip Melanchthon, who was Luther's right-hand man, his number two, with whom Calvin maintained a warm correspondence for the rest of his days. But you understand, though, that these colloquies, or theological discussions between the Romanists and the Protestants, were not and could not possibly be fruitful, because the two parties were and are miles apart. And 2 Corinthians 6 says that it is impossible to mix light and darkness, for there is no fellowship between Christ and Belial, and righteousness and unrighteousness. And Calvin was disturbed, very disturbed, at the willingness to compromise shown by some of the Protestant delegates. Some of them wavered. Some of them were willing to give up bits of the truth to buy a carnal peace and unity with Rome. Whereas Calvin loved the truth too much and understood that it wasn't his truth but God's truth, and that he was called to buy the truth and sell it not. And so he disliked all ambiguity and equivocation. These are the sort of churchmen we need today. Not compromisers, but those who stand fast for the gospel of Christ. It was also in Strasbourg that Calvin found a good thing, as Proverbs 18 verse 22 puts it, a wife. Calvin at this stage is viewed by many as a very eligible bachelor. Several of his friends tried to line him up with a godly woman. And amongst those brought to Calvin was a German noblewoman. About her, Calvin later wrote, however, that he would never think of marrying her, quote, unless the Lord had utterly bereft me of my wits. So he didn't marry her. But on the 6th of August, 1540, he did marry Idelette de Boer. And Idelette de Boer was also born in 1509, 500 years ago. So it's the 500th anniversary of the birth of Calvin and his wife too. Idelette was a widow, a member of his Strasbourg congregation. She, along with her former husband, had been converted from Anabaptism under Calvin's preaching and ministry. And in Strasbourg, I should add, that Calvin was used to bring a lot of Anabaptists to the Reformed faith. Idelette and her former husband were both from what was then called the Lowlands. Jean Stordeur, the husband, was from Liège in what's now called Belgium. So he was a Belgian. Idelette de Boer, she was from Gelderland in what is now called the Netherlands. So Calvin married a Dutch woman. This woman brought with her 2 children from her first marriage. Listen to the words of Philip Schaff, a church historian. Quote, Calvin was attracted by her quiet, modest, gentle character. He found in her what he desired: firm faith, devoted love, and domestic happiness. He calls her the excellent companion of my life, the ever faithful assistant of my ministry, a rare woman. Did John and Idelette Calvin have children? Idelette miscarried once. She lost a daughter at birth and prematurely delivered a son, Jacques, who died after only 2 weeks. This was a very heavy blow to Calvin. One Roman Catholic author sought to rub salt into his wounds and said that Calvin's lack of children was designed by God that the name of this infamous man might not be propagated. To this Calvin replied, "I have myriads of sons throughout the Christian world." After some 8 years and 8 months of happy marriage, Idelette died, aged 40, after an illness. Calvin wrote to his friend William Farrell, quote, "I am trying as much as possible not to be completely overwhelmed with grief. Besides, my friends surround me and do not fail to bring some comfort to my soul's sadness." Calvin would outlive Idelette by 15 years, remaining a widow for the rest of his days. Now, as I mentioned, Calvin was to return to Geneva, and there were two main reasons why the Genevans were forced to bring him back. The first reason involves a cunning Roman Catholic cardinal called Jacob Sadolet. After the expulsion of the reformers from Geneva, the Roman Church saw her chance to take back the city. One of her leaders, Cardinal Sadolet from nearby Carpentras, a well-educated and eloquent man, one of their leaders was commissioned to write to the Genevans a letter urging them to return to the Roman fold. He argued, "The reformers have broken the unity of the church. They have rent the garment, the seamless garment of Christ." Their motives, said Sadolet, are base, quote, "ambition, avarice, love of popular applause, inward fraud, and malice." Well, that's them damned. This left the Genevan Council in a dilemma. They didn't want to go back to Rome, but there was no one in Geneva capable of answering Sadolet. And the other reformers outside of Geneva, like Pierre Viret in Lausanne, refused their request. And I think they deliberately refused their request in order to force them to go back to the one man whom they knew could answer Sadolet. This forced the Genevans to ask Calvin, could you respond to Sadolet? Calvin wrote the reply to Sadolet in Strasbourg in just 6 days. The reply of his being twice the length of Sadolet's letter, and it was masterful. From the scriptures, Calvin showed the justice of the Reformed cause and the rotten apostasy of the Roman Church. He showed this with great force and dignity. As Luther put it, for he read this treatise, Calvin's reply to Sadolet has hands and feet. To Calvin's response, Sadolet made no reply. Come January 1540, the Genevan Little Council of 25 authorized Michael Dubois, a local printer, to publish Calvin's reply in French and Latin at the expense of the city. That's what we need. Ballymena Council to publish this speech, let's say, in English and maybe French as well. In his wise providence,